September 12, 1945, San Francisco Bay. The fog hung thick over the water like a burial shroud, dense enough to taste cold enough to seep through wool and skin straight into bone. The transport ship USS General W.H. Gordon cut through gray waves toward America, its hull groaning with each swell, its deck crowded with women who had been told they were sailing toward their deaths. 237 Japanese women gripped the rails with white knuckles and hollow eyes. Most were young, between 18 and 30. They had served as nurses in field hospitals across the Pacific, radio operators, monitoring communications translators, working with military intelligence clerks, managing supply operations for the Imperial Japanese Army. Now they wore torn uniforms, their hair matted and dirty from 3 weeks below deck, their faces carved hollow by poor rations and the certainty of what awaited them on American soil. They had been told American soldiers were monsters. Demons who would torture them, abuse them, leave them broken and bleeding in ditches. Every propaganda film they had watched in training, every military briefing they had attended, every warning from their commanders painted the same picture. Surrender meant death. Capture meant horrors beyond imagination. The Americans would make them pay for every soldier lost at Pearl Harbor, every Marine killed on Iwo Jima, every pilot shot down over Tokyo. But when the gangway lowered and they stepped onto American soil for the first time, something broke inside them. Not from cruelty, from kindness. And that was far more dangerous than any torture they had imagined, more devastating than any weapon they had faced, because it shattered the one thing that had kept them alive through 3 weeks of terror on that ship. It shattered their certainty about who the enemy was. The seagulls circled overhead like vultures, their cries sharp and mocking in the morning air. Through the fog, the Golden Gate Bridge emerged slowly, impossibly, its red towers rising so high they seemed to pierce the low clouds. The women stared in silence. None had ever seen anything like it. In Japan, most bridges had been bombed to rubble-twisted metal skeletons, spanning rivers that ran red with ash. Here stood a bridge that seemed to touch the sky, untouched, perfect whole. A bridge that proved America had never truly been touched by the war that had consumed their world. "They will kill us when we land," whispered a young woman near the front. Her voice carried across the deck, and others nodded in terrified agreement. Beside her stood Reiko, 19 years old, a radio operator who had worked in the Philippines. Reiko didn't answer. She just stared at the approaching shore, her jaw clenched tight, her hands gripping the rails so hard the metal bit into her palms. She had heard the stories the propaganda officers had told them again and again during the voyage. Americans were savages. They would strip Japanese women of dignity. Death would be a mercy compared to what awaited them in the prison camps. The ship's horn blasted 3 times deep and mournful, the sound rolling across the water and echoing off the distant hills. The women flinched as one body, some beginning to cry softly, others whispering prayers to ancestors, asking for strength in their final moments. A few stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think, their minds blank, with a fear so profound it had moved beyond panic into a strange crystalline stillness. Akiko Tanaka stood at the front of the group, her small frame rigid with the effort of appearing calm. She was 22 years old, though she felt ancient, weathered by the things she had seen in 2 years working field hospitals on Luzon and Leyte. She had sewn wounds in jungle hospitals, while mortars fell close enough to shake surgical instruments off trays. She had held dying soldiers as they called for their mothers, as they wept and begged and finally went silent. She had learned to sleep through the screams of men having limbs amputated without enough morphine. She had learned not to weep when boys younger than her brother died with their intestines in their hands, whispering that they were sorry, so sorry they had failed the emperor. Her fiancé Taro had died at Okinawa in April. Kamikaze pilot. He had volunteered written her a letter the night before his final mission. She carried it in a small cloth bag tied to her waist, the paper worn soft from being read and reread until she had memorized every character, every loop of ink. That was all she had left of him. "I die so you never have to face American cruelty," he had written. "Promise me you will die before they capture you. Promise me you will die with honor." She couldn't keep that promise. When the surrender came in August, her commanding officer had handed her a knife and turned away. She had held it for 3 hours, sitting alone in a bombed-out hospital room, the blade against her wrist, waiting for the courage that never came. And when the American soldiers arrived to round them up, she had hidden the knife in her uniform and walked out with her hands raised alive and ashamed. That failure would save her life. But standing on this ship watching American soldiers appear on the dock below, she wondered if Taro had been right, if death with honor would have been better than whatever came next. As the ship docked at the military pier, American soldiers appeared in loose formations, dozens of them in clean uniforms, smoking cigarettes, talking casually among themselves, as if this were any ordinary morning. The women pressed closer to the rails, staring down at these men they had been taught to fear with every fiber of their being. But something was wrong. Something didn't match the images burned into their minds by years of propaganda. The soldiers weren't snarling, they weren't shouting threats, they weren't pointing their rifles at the ship. They were just standing there waiting, some of them laughing at something one of their friends had said. One soldier, young with red hair and freckles, waved up at the ship, a casual gesture, almost friendly, the kind of wave you might give to a neighbor across the street. Reiko grabbed Akiko's arm hard enough to bruise. "Did you see that?" He waved. "Maybe it's a trick," Reiko whispered back, her voice tight, "to make us feel safe before." She didn't finish the sentence. Neither wanted to imagine what came after before. The gangway lowered with a metallic clang that echoed across the water. American officers appeared at the top of the ramp, clipboards in hand, calling out orders in English the women couldn't understand. Then a translator stepped forward, a Japanese-American soldier with a Nisei patch on his shoulder. He spoke in their language, his accent strange but understandable, shaped by growing up in California rather than Tokyo or Osaka. "You will exit the ship in single file. You will be processed, given medical checks, assigned quarters. No harm will come to you. You are prisoners of war under protection of the Geneva Convention." The women looked at each other, confused and afraid. Geneva Convention, Akiko had never heard those words before. Reiko had, but only in whispers from other radio operators who had intercepted Allied transmissions, whispers that were quickly silenced because they contradicted everything they had been taught about American brutality. They began to move slowly, reluctantly down the gangway. Each step felt like walking toward an execution. The wood creaked under their feet. The fog swirled around them, cold and damp, clinging to their skin. Below, the American soldiers waited, watching them descend with expressions that weren't angry, weren't cruel, but something else entirely. Curious, almost gentle, as if they were watching frightened children rather than enemy combatants. Akiko's foot touched American soil for the first time at 7:43 in the morning. She expected to feel horror. Instead, she felt only confusion, a disorientation so profound it made her dizzy. The first soldier she passed, a man with kind eyes and gray at his temples, smiled at her. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, just a smile the kind her father used to give her when she came home from school. And that was somehow more terrifying than any weapon, because it didn't fit, didn't match, didn't make sense in a world where Americans were supposed to be demons. The women were led into a large white building that smelled of disinfectant and something floral they couldn't identify. The smell was overwhelming after 3 weeks in the ship's hold, which had reeked of unwashed bodies and fear, and the salt water that seeped through every crack. Inside, female American nurses waited, their uniforms crisp and clean, their faces calm and professional. This was the first shock that penetrated the fog of terror. Women. The Americans had sent women to process them. "Please remove your uniforms and place them in these bags," the translator said. "You will be given clean clothing after your medical examination and shower." Panic rippled through the group like wind through wheat. Remove their uniforms in front of strangers, Akiko felt her face burn with shame. In Japan, modesty was everything. To be seen undressed by strangers, even other women, was a humiliation worse than many physical torments. It meant the destruction of dignity, the final stripping away of everything that made them human. 3 younger women at the back began to cry, their voices rising. "We won't undress. Kill us first. Kill us now. We won't be humiliated like this." The translator spoke urgently to one of the American nurses, a woman with auburn hair, pulled back in a tight military bun, and warm brown eyes that had seen too much. The nurse stepped forward. She was older than most of them, maybe 32 or 33, with freckles across her nose and hands that moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked trauma units. She rolled up her left sleeve slowly, deliberately, revealing a long scar that ran from her elbow to her wrist. The translator spoke as she held out her arm for them to see. I understand your fear. I am Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, Army Nurse Corps. When I was captured in the Philippines for 3 days before rescue, I felt the same terror you feel now. A Japanese soldier gave me this scar. I remember his face. I have chosen to remember his face so I can choose to see your faces differently. You are not him. He is not you. You are prisoners of war. You will be treated with dignity. This I promise. Something in her voice, something in the way she met their eyes without hatred or disgust cracked through Akiko's defenses. A tear fell before she could stop it hot against her cold cheek. Around her, other women began to cry as well, soft sobs that filled the room like rain. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to undress. Some women turned their backs, trying to hide themselves. Others moved quickly, as if speed could somehow erase the shame. The American nurses moved among them with gentle efficiency, offering no judgment, no mockery. They simply handed each woman a white towel and pointed toward the next room, their movements matter-of-fact, professional, as if this were the most normal thing in the world rather than the end of everything these women had believed about themselves and their enemy. The medical examination was quick but thorough. The nurses checked for wounds, infections, signs of disease. They wrote notes on clipboards, spoke in soft English to each other, occasionally smiled reassuringly at the frightened women before them. One nurse noticed Akiko's trembling hands and placed her own hand gently on Akiko's shoulder. "It's okay," the nurse said in English. Though Akiko didn't understand the words, she understood the tone, understood the kindness in the woman's eyes. She burst into tears, unable to stop her body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Then came the showers. They were led into a large tiled room where dozens of shower heads lined the walls. More shower heads in one room than Akiko had seen in her entire life. Steam filled the air, warm and thick, condensing on the white tiles and running down in rivulets. The translator explained they should wash thoroughly, that soap would be provided, that they should take as much time as they needed. Take as much time as they needed, as if time were something abundant rather than stolen. Soap, real soap. The women stood frozen, staring at white bars of soap sitting on small shelves beneath each showerhead. They picked them up slowly as if handling something precious and fragile, something that might vanish if they gripped too hard. The soap was smooth, heavy, and smelled like flowers. Like lilacs in spring, like gardens that existed in memory rather than reality, like a world that hadn't been destroyed by war. Reiko turned the water on and gasped as hot water poured over her, steam rising around her in clouds. Hot water, not lukewarm, not cold, hot. She hadn't felt hot water in over a year. In the field hospitals where she had worked monitoring radio traffic and translating intercepted messages, they had been lucky to have any water at all. Often they had washed in streams and rain barrels, in whatever they could find. The idea of hot water coming from a wall, endless and clean, seemed like a miracle or a hallucination. Around her, other women were crying as they washed, some laughing through their tears, the sound high and almost hysterical. Others simply stood under the water, letting it run over their faces, their hair, their bodies, washing away months of dirt and fear and exhaustion. The sound of water filled the room, a roar that drowned out everything else. And in that roar, there was a strange kind of privacy, a space where they could break down without being seen. Akiko scrubbed her skin until it turned pink. She washed her hair 3 times, working her fingers through tangles that had seemed permanent, feeling the weight of dirt and oil dissolve under the soap and water. The soap lathered thick and white, the smell of lilacs surrounding her like a dream. She thought of her mother's garden in Osaka, the way the cherry blossoms had smelled in April, before the war came, before the firebombs turned everything to ash. She thought of being 7 years old and playing in that garden, catching butterflies, believing the world was safe and beautiful, and would stay that way forever. When the water finally began to run clear, when her skin felt raw from scrubbing, she slid down the wall and sat on the tiled floor, her knees pulled to her chest, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. What kind of enemy does this to their prisoners? What kind of monsters give you hot water and soap that smells like lilacs and let you wash until you feel almost human again? An older woman stood at the mirror, touching her own face with trembling fingers, staring at her reflection as if she didn't recognize the woman looking back. "I forgot," she whispered to no one in particular. "I forgot I could look like this. Clean. Almost alive. But her expression darkened as she stared at herself, and she turned away from the mirror, unable to look any longer. Akiko would learn later that her name was Michiko Sato, that she was 34 years old, that she had lost two sons in the Tokyo firebombing while she worked as a translator in Manila. That every moment of comfort in this camp felt like a betrayal of the children who had died with nothing. But beneath the relief, beneath the unexpected comfort of being clean, a darker feeling stirred in all of them. Confusion, shame. They were supposed to be suffering. They were supposed to be tortured. Instead, they had been given soap and hot water and clean clothes. This wasn't how enemies behaved. This wasn't what they had been prepared for. And if the Americans weren't the demons they had been taught to fear, then what did that make them? What did that make all the things they had done in the name of protecting Japan from American savagery? They were led into a mess hall that could have fit 300 people. Long tables stretched across the room, each one covered with a clean white cloth. The smell hit them before they even entered, so powerful it stopped several women in the doorway unable to move forward. Bread baking, meat cooking, coffee brewing, butter melting. The scent was so rich, so overwhelming, so impossible after years of rice gruel and pickled vegetables that Akiko felt saliva flood her mouth, a sensation she had almost forgotten. "Please take a seat," the translator said. "Lunch will be served." The women shuffled to the tables and sat their backs rigid, their hands folded in their laps. They looked at each other with startled, frightened eyes, searching for understanding in faces as confused as their own. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of trick. Maybe the food was poison. Maybe this was the last meal before the torture began. In their training, they had been told about psychological warfare, about how the Americans would break their spears with false kindness before revealing their true cruelty. American soldiers in white kitchen uniforms appeared carrying large trays. They moved down the rows, placing plates in front of each woman with the same casual efficiency as the nurses, as if serving enemy prisoners were an everyday occurrence, rather than something unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. Akiko stared down at her plate and felt her breath catch in her throat. Roast chicken golden and glistening with fat. Mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy in the center. Green beans still steaming. A thick slice of white bread with a pat of yellow butter already melting into the warm surface. And beside the plate, a glass of cold milk and a cup of steaming coffee. Real coffee that smelled like earth and richness and luxury beyond measure. She hadn't seen this much food on one plate in 3 years. Not since before the war, before the rationing, before the bombs started falling, and everything became about survival rather than living. Around her, the other women sat frozen, staring at their meals, as if they were looking at something sacred or forbidden, or both. No one moved, no one ate. They just looked at the food as if it might vanish if they blinked, as if this were a dream they were all sharing, and movement might wake them back into the nightmare of reality. "Please eat," the translator said gently. "It's for you." Still no one moved. The smell of the food filled the room, tormenting them with its richness. Akiko could feel her stomach cramping with hunger, her body demanding she eat, but her mind couldn't make her hand move toward the fork. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The food began to cool, the steam rising from the plates growing thinner. Finally, Reiko picked up her fork. Her hands shook as she cut a small piece of chicken and lifted it to her mouth. She chewed slowly, her eyes closing, her face transforming with an expression that was almost painful to watch. The taste exploded on her tongue, rich and savory and real. She chewed and swallowed, and then she started to cry, tears streaming down her face as she cut another piece and another, unable to stop eating or stop crying. Her body caught between hunger and grief. That broke the dam. Women all around her began to eat, some slowly and carefully, others frantically, as if the food might be taken away at any moment. Tears streamed down faces as they chewed. Some women laughed between bites, the sound desperate and joyful at the same time, a release of tension that had been building for weeks. Others ate in silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, their minds unable to process what was happening. Akiko bit into the bread, and the soft texture made her gasp. She had eaten bread made from sawdust and tree bark for the last year of the war, rough stuff that tore at your throat and left your stomach cramping with its emptiness. This bread was soft, white, perfect. She spread butter on it with trembling fingers, watching it melt into the warm surface, and took another bite. The richness made her dizzy, made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. Across the table, the older woman Akiko had seen at the mirror was crying so hard she couldn't eat. She held a piece of chicken in her hand, staring at it, her whole body shaking with sobs. "My children," she whispered. "My children burned in Tokyo, and I'm eating chicken. I'm eating chicken." The guilt hit all of them at once, crashing through the brief moment of relief like a wave through a sandcastle. While they sat here eating roast chicken and mashed potatoes, their families in Japan were picking through rubble for scraps. Their children were eating grass soup. Their parents were dying of starvation in the ruins of bombed cities. And here they were, enemy prisoners being fed better than their own country had fed them, even before the surrender, better than their families might eat for years to come. Some women pushed their plates away, unable to continue. Others ate everything, driven by a hunger so deep it overrode shame and guilt. A hunger that had been their constant companion for so long, they couldn't deny it even in their guilt. A few ate and cried at the same time, tears falling into their mashed potatoes, their bodies unable to choose between relief and anguish. The American soldiers watched from the edges of the room, their expressions unreadable. A few looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. One young soldier with red hair and freckles whispered to the man beside him, "They're crying, Sarge. Should we do something?" The older soldier, a man with gray at his temples and tired eyes, replied quietly, "Just let them eat, Kowalski. They'll be okay." But would they? Sitting in that mess hall eating food that tasted like betrayal and survival at the same time, Akiko wasn't sure of anything anymore. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. The enemy was supposed to hate them. But this felt like something else entirely. And that was the most frightening thing of all, because it meant everything they had believed, everything they had been taught, everything they had suffered for, might have been built on lies. Standing in the doorway of the mess hall, Sergeant James Whitmore crushed another lucky strike under his boot and lit a new one with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He was 28 years old but looked 40, his face lined with grief that had carved itself into his features over 4 years. He watched the Japanese women cry over their food and felt something twist in his chest, something he didn't want to feel, something that made him want to walk away and never come back. December 7th, 1941. That date was carved into him deeper than any scar. He had been at Pearl Harbor working communications at Hickam Field. He had been in the barracks when the first bombs fell, had run outside in his undershirt to see planes with red circles on their wings diving through smoke and fire. He had spent 3 days pulling bodies from rubble, some of them so badly burned he couldn't tell if they were men or women, soldiers or civilians. His wife Catherine had been at home in Honolulu with their daughter Emma, 3 years old, with his eyes and Catherine's smile, a little girl who loved pancakes and her stuffed rabbit and the way the ocean looked in the morning. They had been planning to take her to the beach that afternoon. Instead, a bomb had fallen on their street, on their house, on everything he had loved in the world. By the time he got there, there was nothing left but rubble and smoke and the smell that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had carried that image for 1,375 days. Every morning when he woke up, it was there. Every night when he closed his eyes, it was there. Catherine's hand still holding Emma's in the rubble. He had volunteered for POW duty 3 months ago, thinking it would help, thinking that seeing Japanese prisoners suffer would fill the empty space inside him, would give him something that felt like justice or revenge, or at least meaning for the rage that burned in his chest like a coal that never went cold. But watching these women cry over roast chicken, he felt nothing but sick, because the crying he heard sounded exactly like Emma used to cry when she had nightmares. And he couldn't tell the difference anymore between the sound his daughter had made and the sound these enemy women were making. They all sounded the same. Human, broken, afraid. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan emerged from the mess hall and found him smoking in the hallway, his face gray. "You okay, Jim? I hear them crying and I think good they should cry," he said, his voice flat. Catherine and Emma never got hot showers before they burned. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching him with the same gentle patience she used with trauma patients. "And if we give them cold water and cruelty, does that bring Catherine and Emma back? Or does it just make more ghosts?" She said nothing, just walked away, leaving the question hanging in the air between them. But her words lodged in his mind like shrapnel, painful and impossible to remove. He didn't have an answer. He had been hating for so long, he didn't know how to do anything else. And the idea that mercy might be possible, that kindness might be anything other than weakness or betrayal, made him feel like he was standing on ground that was crumbling beneath his feet. The days took on a rhythm that felt surreal in its ordinariness. Every morning at 6:30, a bell rang across the camp, gentle and clear. The women woke dressed in their simple gray dresses, made their beds with military precision, a habit none could break even as prisoners. Breakfast was served at 7 in the mess hall. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, fresh fruit apples and oranges and sometimes bananas, coffee and milk. Every single morning, this abundance appeared on their tables as if by magic, as if food were limitless, rather than the precious commodity they had known for years. After breakfast, work assignments were given. But these weren't the brutal labor details they had expected based on stories of Allied prisoners in Japanese camps. Some women were assigned to the camp, laundry washing uniforms and large mechanical washers that did most of the work for them, and others worked in the kitchens, helping to prepare meals under the supervision of American cooks who taught them recipes and laughed at their attempts to pronounce English words. A few with English skills were put to work translating documents or teaching basic Japanese phrases to curious American soldiers who wanted to understand the language of their former enemy. Akiko was assigned to the camp hospital, helping the nurses with basic tasks, folding bandages, organizing supplies, cleaning equipment. The work was light, almost gentle. Nothing like the brutal exhaustion of field hospital work, where she had been on her feet for 18 hours at a stretch, where sleep had been something stolen in 10-minute increments between waves of casualties. She worked alongside Lieutenant Brennan and another nurse named Margaret Women, who treated her not as an enemy or prisoner, but as a colleague, teaching her how to use unfamiliar medical equipment, sharing their lunches with her, asking about her training in Japan, as if they were genuinely interested rather than interrogating her. The most shocking part came on Fridays. They were paid. Every woman received a small amount of camp script paper currency that could only be used within the camp, but was worth something nonetheless. With this money, they could visit the camp canteen, a small store stocked with items that seemed impossible. Chocolate bars, Hershey's, Nestle, Baby Ruth. The women stood in front of the candy display like children at a shrine, their eyes wide with disbelief. Back in Japan, chocolate had disappeared years ago, reserved only for the military elite, and even then only in small quantities. Here, enemy prisoners could buy it with their labor wages, could choose between different brands, could eat as much as they could afford. Cigarettes, lipstick, hand lotion, pencils and notebooks, small bottles of perfume, handkerchiefs with embroidered flowers. These weren't necessities. These were luxuries, things that made life more than mere survival, things that said you were human, rather than just a body being kept alive. Reiko bought a chocolate bar on her first visit to the canteen, spending half her wages on a single Hershey's bar. She carried it back to the barracks like a treasure, unwrapping it, slowly breaking off one square at a time, letting each piece melt on her tongue. The sweetness was almost painful after years without sugar. She closed her eyes, savoring it, and whispered to Akiko, "I'm eating chocolate. We're prisoners of war, and I'm eating chocolate." This routine, this strange, gentle, almost domestic routine, began to wear down their resistance more effectively than any torture could have. Their bodies grew stronger. Color returned to their cheeks. They gained weight, their hollow faces filling out their bones, no longer pressing sharp against their skin. But with physical health came mental turmoil, because every day of comfort was also a day of guilt. Every meal was a reminder that their families were starving. Every bar of chocolate was a betrayal of everyone suffering back home. And yet they couldn't stop accepting it. They couldn't refuse the food, the warmth, the small kindnesses. They were trapped not by barbed wire, but by the paradox of an enemy who treated them better than their own country ever had. October 3rd, 1945, 2 in the morning. The camp was dark except for the perimeter lights that cast long shadows across empty pathways. Corporal Thomas Hayes made his routine check of the women's barracks flashlight, sweeping across rows of bunks, where 237 enemy prisoners slept fitfully in the California night. His beam caught an empty bunk, then another. He counted quickly, heart beginning to race. 2 women missing. He found the first one in the latrine, sick from something she had eaten. But the second woman, Michiko Sato, was nowhere in the barracks. Hayes moved faster now, checking the common areas, the recreation room, the small chapel they had opened for any prisoners who wanted to pray. Nothing. Then he heard water running from the shower building, a sound that didn't belong in the dead of night. The door opened silently. Steam hung in the air despite the cold October night. And there in the corner, sitting on white tile that was no longer white, sat Michiko with her wrists opened and blood pooling around her like a spreading shadow. She was crying, whispering in Japanese, her voice rhythmic, like a prayer or a lullaby. "Forgive me, my sons. Forgive me. I should have died with you. I should have died with you." Haze hit the alarm. The sound split the night, bringing soldiers running from every direction. Sergeant Jim Whitmore arrived first, still pulling on his jacket, moving on instinct before his mind had fully registered what the emergency might be. He saw the blood and his training took over. Pressure on wounds, shout for medic, maintain consciousness. His hands moved automatically, pressing down on Michiko's wrists while shouting for medical supplies for Lieutenant Brennan, for anyone who could help save a life that was pouring out onto white tile. But then he saw her face. Really saw her, not an enemy, not Japanese. A mother. She was 34 years old with gray streaks in her hair that were far too early, with lines around her eyes carved by grief rather than age. She looked up at him with eyes that were already somewhere else, somewhere beyond this room in this moment, and she spoke in broken English that came from some desperate place inside her. "My sons, Tokyo, fire. Please let me go to them." Jim's hands shook as he applied pressure, blood seeping between his fingers, warm and sticky, and too much like other blood he had held. Other bodies he had tried to save. He thought of Emma at 3 years old, crying for her mother after a bad dream. Emma's small body in the rubble, still wearing the yellow dress Catherine had made for her, the one with flowers on the pockets. This woman wanted to die to be with her sons. Jim wanted to die to be with his daughter. They were separated by language and nation and all the weight of war, but in that moment, they were exactly the same. Two people who had lost everything and didn't know how to keep living in a world that had taken the only things that mattered. "Don't you die on me," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't you fucking die on me." Lieutenant Sarah Brennan arrived with a medical kit, her hair loose from sleep, but her hands steady as they had been through 2 years of war. "Jim, I've got her. You can let go. I can't. If I let go, she dies. She won't die, but you have to let me save her." Sarah's hands replaced his, professional and sure. She had done this before, had saved lives in worse conditions with less equipment. She worked quickly, cleaning the wounds, applying pressure points, calling for supplies. One of the other nurses arrived with a blood transfusion kit. Sarah didn't hesitate, offering her own arm. "Universal donor," she said calmly. "Let's get her stable." Jim backed away slowly, his hands covered in Michiko's blood, shaking so hard he had to clench them into fists to make it stop. He walked outside into the cold October air and stood in the darkness, smoking Lucky Strike after Lucky Strike, each one burning down to his fingers, before he noticed and crushed it under his boot. By the time Lieutenant Brennan emerged at dawn, he had smoked through half a pack, and his hands still wouldn't stop shaking. "She'll live," Sarah said. "Thanks to you. I don't know why I saved her. I should have let her die. She's the enemy." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the growing light. "You saved her because you're not the man you think you are. You're better than that. I'm not better. I'm just tired. I'm so fucking tired of hating." "Then maybe it's time to try something else." She put her hand on his shoulder and left him standing there as the sun rose over San Francisco Bay, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for a world that contained so much pain. Jim stood watching the light change and felt something shift inside him, something he didn't have words for, something that felt like the first crack in ice that had been frozen solid for 4 years. When the women learned of Michiko's suicide attempt at morning assembly, the news moved through them like wind through dry grass. Akiko volunteered immediately to help care for her. She had been a field nurse. She knew how to handle trauma patients, knew the careful balance between firmness and gentleness that kept someone alive when part of them wanted desperately to die. But the real reason was simpler and more painful. Akiko understood. Every meal was guilt. Every bar of soap was betrayal. Every hot shower was a reminder that her family was suffering while she lived in comfort. Michiko had just done what Akiko thought about every single day, what whispered to her in the dark hours before dawn, when the barracks were quiet and there was nothing to distract from the weight of being alive. She sat beside Machiko's hospital bed for 3 days, holding her bandaged hand, saying nothing because there was nothing to say that would make the truth easier. When Machiko finally woke, her first words were a question that had no good answer. "Why did you save me? I don't deserve to live." Akiko was quiet for a long time, watching the older woman's face. "I don't know if any of us deserve to live, but we're alive, and maybe that means something." What could it possibly mean? "My sons are dead. I wasn't there. I was translating documents in Manila while they burned in Tokyo." What kind of mother survives her children? "The worst kind," Akiko said softly. "The kind who has to keep living with that knowledge. But you're not alone in that. We're all the worst kind of something." They sat in silence as morning light moved across the hospital floor, two women trying to figure out how to live in a world that had taken everything that made life worth living and then had the cruelty to keep them breathing anyway. October 15th, mail call. The first letters from Japan since the women's arrival had been processed through military sensors and Red Cross channels. Names were called in the mess hall after breakfast. Some women received nothing. Others got thin envelopes that had traveled across an ocean and through official channels that had delayed them for weeks. Akiko's name was called. She took the envelope with trembling hands, the paper so thin she could almost see through it her mother's handwriting. Familiar and strange, at the same time smaller than it used to be, more cramped, as if even the act of writing required conservation of resources. She sat on her bunk in the afternoon light and opened it slowly, carefully, as if the paper might crumble at rough handling. Her mother's words wandered across the page in uneven lines, the elegant script she remembered from childhood, now uncertain, shaky with age or hunger or grief or all three. "My dear Akiko, we received word you are alive in America. Such relief that you live. Such sorrow for what you must endure. Tokyo is gone. Our house is rubble. Your father and I live in shelter made of metal sheets. We eat once per day. Today, rice water and cabbage stems. Your little brother Kenji grows thinner each week. He is 10 now, so tall but so thin. He asks for you constantly, asks when sister comes home, asks if we will ever have sweets again. No sweets remain in all of Tokyo, but we survive. Father's cough worsens. I fear winter coming. We have no heat, but we pray for you nightly. Pray Americans treat you with mercy we know you deserve. Return to us when you can, my daughter. We wait for you. Mother." Akiko read the letter 3 times, each reading, driving the words deeper into her chest like nails. Her 10-year-old brother was starving, asking for sweets. And yesterday she had bought a Hershey's chocolate bar at the canteen. She had eaten it slowly, savoring each bite, letting it melt on her tongue, while she sat in a heated barracks wearing clean clothes after a hot shower. Her father was dying of cough with no medicine. And she had been given aspirin last week for a headache-free, just given to her, as if medicine were abundant rather than precious. Her mother lived in a metal sheet shelter, and Akiko slept in a bed with wool blankets in a heated building on American soil. How can I live with this? How can I eat knowing they starve? How can I sleep warm, knowing they freeze? How can I accept chocolate from the enemy, knowing my brother will never taste sweetness again? Taro had died believing she would suffer under American cruelty. Instead, she suffered under American kindness. And she didn't know which was worse, didn't know how to reconcile the reality of her captivity with everything she had been taught about honor and sacrifice and what it meant to be Japanese. She sank to the floor beside her bunk and sobbed silently, her body shaking with grief and guilt in a confusion so profound it felt like drowning. For 3 days she couldn't eat. Not wouldn't, but couldn't. Every time she tried to lift fork to mouth, she saw Kenji's thin face asking for sweets. Every time she smelled food, she thought of her mother eating cabbage stems. Her body began to shut down. Dizziness, weakness, her vision blurred at the edges. The other women noticed, grew concerned, tried to encourage her. Reiko brought her favorite foods from the mess hall, but Akiko couldn't swallow, couldn't make her throat work, couldn't force food down knowing what each bite meant. Lieutenant Brennan called her to the hospital office on the 4th day. Akiko came reluctantly, moving slowly, her body weak from not eating. Sarah sat behind a desk covered in medical charts and looked at her with the same gentle concern she gave all her patients, enemy or American, making no difference in how she approached suffering. "You're not eating," why Akiko spoke through the translator, a young Nisei woman who had been helping with administrative tasks. "My brother starves while I eat chicken. How can I swallow food knowing this starving yourself won't feed your brother? It just creates two tragedies instead of one. Then what am I supposed to do? Accept your kindness, forget my family, become comfortable in captivity?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her face thoughtful. "I don't know, but I know dying of guilt helps no one. And I know this, survival isn't betrayal, it's just survival. What you do with that survival, that's what matters. Your mother didn't write that letter so you'd starve yourself. She wrote it so you'd remember why you need to survive, so you can go home to them, so you can see your brother again. You can't do that if you're dead." Akiko wanted to argue, wanted to explain that death would at least be honest, would at least be a form of loyalty to everyone suffering while she lived in enemy comfort. But she didn't have the strength for arguments. She just sat there hollow and exhausted, while Sarah watched her with patient eyes. The door opened. Sergeant Jim Whitmore entered carrying a tray with a bowl of soup, the steam rising in gentle spirals. He stopped when he saw Akiko's surprise crossing his face. Then he set the tray on the desk. "Heard you weren't eating. Made you something." Akiko looked up at him confused. "You cook?" "Not really, but I heated up some soup. Chicken noodle. My wife Catherine used to make it for Emma when she was sick." He paused, his face closing off at the mention of their names, then continued. "Eat it or don't. Your choice." He turned to leave. Akiko found her voice speaking in halting English that she had been learning from the other women and the soldiers. "Wait. Why you help me, I am enemy." Jim stopped in the doorway, his back to her. He was silent for a long moment. "Because watching you starve yourself reminds me too much of what I've been doing for 4 years. Just different kind of starvation." He walked out without looking back. Akiko stared at the soup. The smell made her stomach cramp with hunger despite her determination not to eat. She picked up the spoon, took one small sip. The warmth spread through her chest, and before she could stop herself, she took another sip and another. It wasn't acceptance, it wasn't forgetting. It was just soup, and she was just eating it, and maybe that was enough for now. Maybe survival didn't have to mean betrayal. Maybe it could just mean staying alive long enough to figure out what came next. November arrived with cold, rain, and preparations for a holiday Akiko didn't understand. Thanksgiving, the Americans called it. A day about gratitude for survival, for harvest, for peace. The camp commander, Colonel Richard Harrison, announced that the prisoners would be invited to help prepare the traditional feast. "You've survived," he said at morning assembly. "The war's over. Peace is coming. We want you to be part of our tradition." Akiko was assigned to kitchen duty with Private Danny Kowalski, the young soldier with red hair and freckles who had waved at them from the dock that first morning. He was 20 years old and had never seen combat, had lost his older brother at Guadalcanal, but somehow still smiled at everyone like the world was fundamentally good. He treated Akiko like a colleague rather than a prisoner, teaching her to peel potatoes without cutting herself laughing when she revealed that she had been a nurse and certainly knew how to use a knife. "This is one potato," she asked, holding up a massive Idaho potato that seemed impossibly large compared to the small sweet potatoes she remembered from home. "Welcome to America," he said, grinning. "Everything's bigger here, including our potatoes and our hearts." Despite herself, despite everything, Akiko laughed. It was the first time she had genuinely laughed in months, and the sound surprised her, almost frightened her with its normalcy. Danny taught her to make pumpkin pie, his mother's recipe from Iowa. "The secret's in the spices," he explained. "Cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves." As they worked mixing, filling in a large bowl, Akiko found herself talking about Kenji, about how he loved sweet things, about how there were no sweets left in Tokyo. "My brother loves sweet things too," Danny said quietly. "He always wanted the biggest slice of pie at Thanksgiving." He paused, his hands stilling in their work. "War's stupid, isn't it? Takes away all the people who love sweet things." "Yes," Akiko agreed softly. "Very stupid. Tell you what, when this is all really over, when your family can visit America, I'll make your brother my ma's pumpkin pie." "Deal's deal." They shook hands, and in that moment, something shifted. Not forgiveness, because there was too much to forgive on both sides, but perhaps the beginning of something else. An acknowledgement that they were both just people who had lost people, who were trying to figure out how to keep living in a world that had taken too much. November 21st, the day before Thanksgiving. Jim was doing routine inspection of the hospital when he noticed Akiko's locker standing open. A photograph fell out, drifted to the floor like a leaf. He picked it up automatically, then froze. A young man in Imperial Japanese Navy pilot uniform, formal pose, serious expression. The kind of photograph taken before deployment, before missions from which pilots didn't return. "Who's this?" he asked Akiko, who was organizing medical supplies nearby. She turned and her face went pale. "My fiancé, Taro Nakamura. He died at Okinawa." Jim felt something cold spread through his chest. Okinawa. Battle of Okinawa. Yes, April 1945. He was kamikaze pilot. The room seemed to tilt. "I was at Okinawa. My unit shot down 47 kamikaze planes over 2 days. 47 pilots tried to kill us. 47 pilots who thought dying for the emperor was honorable. He died to protect his family." Akiko said, her voice rising with defensiveness and grief. "He was told Americans would destroy everything, and my wife died protecting our daughter." Jim shot back. "Died for nothing. Died because a bomb fell on her head while she was buying groceries." They stood facing each other, breathing hard, years of war compressed into the space between them. Jim's voice cracked. "I might have killed him. Do you understand that I might have pulled the trigger that killed your fiancé? How am I supposed to, how do I, and Japanese bomb killed your family?" Akiko interrupted, her own voice breaking. "We both lose everyone. We both suffer. So tell me, what is point? What is point of all this hate?" Long silence filled the room. Both of them were crying now, tears running down faces twisted with pain that had no outlet, no resolution, no answer. Jim spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I don't know. I've been hating for so long, I don't know how to stop." "I also don't know," Akiko whispered. "I hate Americans for winning. I hate Japan for losing. I hate myself for being alive. But hate is tired. I am tired." "Yeah, me too." They stood in that shared exhaustion, in that moment of brutal honesty, and something between them shifted. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of an end to being enemies. Perhaps the first crack in the walls they had both built around their grief walls that had kept them safe but also kept them frozen in a past that couldn't be changed no matter how much they hated or suffered or wished things were different. Tomorrow they would sit at the same Thanksgiving table. They would share a meal. They wouldn't become friends. Not yet. But they would stop being enemies. And that small shift would open a door neither had known existed, a door that led not to forgetting or excusing but to something more difficult and more necessary. The possibility of living in a world where the person across from you had caused you unbearable pain and was also just a person trying to survive that same pain. The possibility of mercy in a world built on vengeance. The possibility that kindness might be harder than hate, but also the only thing that could save any of them from drowning in all they had lost. November 22nd, 1945. Thanksgiving morning, the mess hall had been transformed overnight into something that belonged in a different world, a gentler world where war was a memory rather than the air they breathed. Paper turkeys hung from the rafters, made by prisoners and soldiers working together in art therapy sessions, their attempts at American iconography clumsy but earnest. Autumn leaves carefully collected and pressed lined the tables in arrangements that spoke of care and time. Hand-drawn banners stretched across the walls with words painted in uneven letters. Thanksgiving 1945. Gratitude. Peace. Welcome. In the kitchen since 4 a.m, sounds and smells built into a symphony of abundance. 20 turkeys roasted in massive ovens, their skins turning golden brown, fat sizzling and popping, the rich smell filling every corner of the building. Potatoes were mashed in enormous pots, the rhythmic thump of mashers against metal creating a percussion that mixed with the voices of cooks calling instructions. Pie crusts baked in waves, the warm smell of cinnamon and nutmeg and butter layering over everything else until the air itself seemed edible. Akiko stood beside Danny at a counter covered in pumpkins, helping him prepare the final batch of pies. Her hands moved with the careful precision of surgical training, measuring spices, mixing filling, working the dough with a gentleness that came from 2 years of learning to handle broken things. These are perfect, Danny said, examining the pies with the seriousness of someone presenting important work. Your brother's gonna love this recipe when you make it for him. If I remember, Akiko said quietly, if I make it home. When you make it home, Danny corrected firmly. Not if, when. He looked at her with such certainty, such simple faith that things would work out because they had to, that Akiko felt something catch in her throat. When she repeated, trying the word on for size, trying to believe it. Across the camp in his small quarters, Jim Whitmore sat on his bunk holding a photograph. Catherine and Emma on the beach the summer before the war. Catherine laughing at something outside the frame, Emma building a sandcastle with fierce concentration, her tongue sticking out slightly, the way it always did when she focused hard on something. He hadn't slept. Thanksgiving had been Catherine's favorite holiday. She would spend 3 days cooking, singing in the kitchen, filling their small house with smells and warmth and life. Emma would help, mostly just making a mess with flour, getting more on herself than in any bowl, laughing that high child's laugh that could cut through any darkness. This was the first Thanksgiving since their deaths. He had volunteered to work, had requested duty assignments, had done everything he could to avoid this day. But Colonel Harrison had insisted everyone attend, prisoners and staff alike. No exceptions, no excuses. We're building something here, the colonel had said. Something that matters. You're part of that, whether you like it or not. Jim set the photograph on his footlocker and stood straightening his uniform, with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. He didn't know if he could face this. Didn't know if he could sit at a table celebrating gratitude when the only thing he felt grateful for was that each day ended and he survived it. But Catherine would have wanted him there. Emma would have wanted him to be kind. So he would go, he would sit, he would try not to break. At noon, the bell rang. 237 Japanese women and 180 American personnel gathered in the mess hall, filing in with an awkwardness that came from trying to navigate a situation none of them had been trained for. The Americans didn't know how to treat former enemies at a holiday meal. The prisoners didn't know how to accept hospitality from people they had been taught to fear. So they moved carefully, politely, sitting where they were directed, Japanese women and American soldiers mixed together at long tables rather than separated former combatants, sharing space in a way that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Colonel Harrison stood at the front of the room, a man in his 50s with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had seen enough war to know what it cost. Today we give thanks, he began, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, for the end of war, for peace coming, for the reminder that even in our darkest times we can choose mercy over vengeance, humanity over hate. To our guests, he gestured toward the Japanese women. You are prisoners by law of war, but today you are guests at our table. Welcome. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and uncertain. Then Private Kowalski started clapping his hands, coming together in the quiet room with an enthusiasm that refused to acknowledge the strangeness of the moment. Others joined slowly, the sound-building Americans, and then some of the Japanese women, the applause spreading like something contagious, until it filled the space with noise that was easier than words. Jim took his seat at the end of a table, moving automatically, his mind elsewhere. Akiko happened to be across from him. Neither had chosen this placement. Neither could avoid it. And beside Jim, an empty chair. He looked at it and felt his chest tighten. This is where Emma would sit. She would kick her legs under the table because she couldn't reach the floor yet. She would want cranberry sauce first. Always cranberry sauce, would get it all over her face and laugh when Catherine tried to wipe it clean. Lieutenant Brennan, sitting beside him, noticed his fixed stare. Jim, you okay? His hand moved to touch the empty chair, fingers resting on the wooden back. She'd be 7 now, if she'd lived. 7 years old. She'd be in second grade. She'd be reading books. She'd still want me to check her closet for monsters before bed. His voice broke. She'd be here, and she'd be so excited about the pie, and He couldn't finish. Sarah squeezed his hand, saying nothing because there was nothing to say that would make it better. Several seats down, Machiko heard him. She understood empty chairs better than anyone. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, and the room went quiet as she walked to Jim's table. Everyone watched as she approached the empty chair and bowed deeply, tears already streaming down her face. The translator spoke her words into English. I understand empty chairs. I have 2. My sons, age 8 and 6. They died in Tokyo fire. I tried to die too, but you saved me. I do not understand why, but I thank you. This chair, she touched it gently, reverently. This is sacred space. I will honor it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small origami crane folded from a napkin with shaking hands. She had been making them for weeks, sitting in the hospital during her recovery, folding paper into birds that symbolized hope and peace and prayers for the dead. She placed it carefully on the empty chair, then bowed again and returned to her seat. The room remained silent. Jim stared at the crane, a small white bird on an empty chair, and felt something break open in his chest. Akiko watched this moment and understood something that had been forming in her mind for weeks, crystallizing now into clarity. They were all sitting at tables with empty chairs. Americans, Japanese, Germans, British, everyone touched by this war had lost someone, had empty spaces where people used to be. The war hadn't cared which side anyone went on. It had just taken and taken and taken until the whole world was full of empty chairs and people left behind trying to figure out how to keep living. She stood and walked to the chair, aware of every eye on her, feeling the weight of the moment, but knowing she had to do this, had to make this gesture or remain forever trapped in the prison of her own grief. She pulled Taro's photograph from her pocket, the one Jim had seen fall from her locker, and placed it beside the crane. She bowed to Jim, her voice steady despite the tears. My fiancé, Taro Nakamura. He died at Okinawa. He was not evil man. He was scared man who loved his family. Like your wife. Like your daughter. He did not deserve to die. None of them did. She looked Jim in the eyes. I cannot bring them back. You cannot bring Taro back. But we can remember them together. Not as enemies. As people who loved and were loved. Jim's composure shattered. He covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that came from 4 years of holding everything too tight. Lieutenant Brennan started to stand, but he waved her off. He looked up at Akiko, his face wet with tears, his voice raw. I wanted to hate you. I needed to see you as the enemy. Because if you were just a person, just someone who lost someone, then what was it all for? What did Catherine and Emma die for? They died because war is stupid, Akiko said, crying as well. Taro died because war is stupid. Your Emma, my Taro, Machiko's sons, they all died because people forgot. We are all just people. The silence in the room was absolute. 300 people watching two former enemies stand at an empty chair and speak the truth that everyone knew, but no one wanted to say. That there were no good deaths in war. That everyone lost someone. That hate was heavy and exhausting and ultimately meaningless because it couldn't bring anyone back. Jim stood slowly. He extended his hand across the table. Truce. Akiko stared at his hand. In Japanese culture, this gesture was loaded with meaning, spoke of acceptance and respect, and a willingness to move forward. She took his hand, felt his grip firm and warm and human. Truce. The room exhaled. Someone started passing food, and the spell broke. People moving and talking, the moment of profound silence, giving way to the ordinary sounds of a meal. But something had shifted. Everyone felt it. A door had opened that none of them had known existed. A possibility that the person across from you could be both someone who had hurt you and someone who was hurt, that mercy and justice weren't opposites, but two parts of the same difficult truth. Platters of turkey moved down the tables, golden and steaming. Bowls of mashed potatoes with butter melting into yellow pools. Gravy boats passed hand to hand, the rich brown liquid, thick and fragrant. Stuffing with sage and onions and celery. Cranberry sauce, tart and sweet. Green bean casserole with crispy onions on top. The food was abundant beyond measure, more food than most of the Japanese women had seen in years, more than some of them had ever seen on one table. At first there was awkward silence, people eating carefully, unsure how to navigate this strange piece. Then Private Kowalski, who seemed incapable of staying quiet for long, called across the table. Miss Reiko, you gotta try the sweet potato casserole. It's got marshmallows on top. Reiko looked at him confused. Marshmallows on vegetables, I know, right? Sounds crazy, tastes amazing. Trust me. She tried it, her face transforming with surprise and pleasure. This is wonderful, how do you make this? Danny launched into an enthusiastic explanation of his mother's recipe, and suddenly the table was alive with conversation. Americans teaching Japanese women English food words. Japanese women teaching Americans phrases in their language. Nurse Margaret and Machiko practicing pronunciation together, laughing at their mutual inability to make certain sounds. At another table, a young soldier was showing a photograph of his farm in Kansas, and a Japanese woman was showing a picture of her rice field near Kyoto, and they were realizing that farmers everywhere faced the same struggles with weather and pests and the hope that the harvest would be good. Jim and Akiko ate in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, not hostile. They had said what needed to be said. There was nothing left but to sit together and eat and try to figure out what came after the moment when you stopped being enemies. Danny brought out the pies, carrying them high with the pride of someone presenting important work. Okay, moment of truth. Miss Akiko helped make the pumpkin pie. Who wants the first slice? Jim raised his hand. I'll try it. Danny cut a generous slice and served Jim with ceremony. This one's special. Made with love. Right, Miss Akiko? Akiko blushed. I do not know about love. I try to follow recipe. Jim took a bite and closed his eyes. For a moment, his face transformed, became younger, less weighted with grief. He opened his eyes and looked at Akiko. Catherine would have loved this. Emma would have eaten 3 slices and gotten sick. He smiled through tears. Thank you. Thank you for letting me help, Akiko replied. For letting me be useful. For treating us like people. You are people. Took me too long to see that. But I see it now. As the meal wound down, as plates were cleared and coffee was poured, people began to share stories. Lieutenant Brennan talked about Thanksgivings growing up in Boston, her Irish grandmother's traditions, the way the whole family would crowd into a too-small house and argue and laugh and eat until they couldn't move. Michiko shared about rice harvest festivals in Japan before the war, how the whole village would celebrate children running through the fields, everyone grateful for abundance that seemed guaranteed to continue forever. Reiko told a story about her grandmother teaching her to make mochi, pounding the rice with a wooden mallet, her grandmother's hands guiding hers, teaching her the rhythm. Her grandmother had died in the war. The recipe was lost. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, a Chinese-American volunteer who had been helping in the camp, leaned forward. I know mochi recipe. My grandmother taught me. I will teach you. We keep memories alive this way. This moment, different cultures and languages and histories sharing food and stories around tables where former enemies sat together, this was peace in its smallest and most powerful form. Not treaties or surrenders, but people choosing to see each other as human, choosing to share rather than hoard, choosing mercy over revenge, even when revenge would have been easier. December arrived with cold rain and fog that wrapped the camp in gray dampness. More letters arrived from Japan, each one bringing news that was hard to bear. Reiko learned her mother had died of pneumonia in November. She hadn't seen her in 3 years, hadn't been able to say goodbye. Another woman learned her entire village was gone, firebombed until nothing remained but ash and memory. Michiko received no letters. She had no one left to write. Akiko's second letter came on December 10th. She opened it with hands that shook because she knew whatever it contained would hurt. Her mother's words were smaller now, more cramped, written on paper that was barely paper anymore. Dearest Akiko, winter is hard. Father's cough worse. We have small fire now, burning what we can find. Old wood, papers. Yesterday I burned your school certificates to keep warm. Forgive me. Kenji asks about you every day. I tell him his sister is in America being brave. He says, is America really full of monsters? Like the teacher said, I don't know what to tell him. Red Cross package arrived last week. Canned milk, chocolate bar. Kenji cried when he tasted chocolate, first sweet thing in 2 years. He said, Mama, is this what Akiko eats? I didn't have the heart to tell him yes. Stay strong, my daughter. Come home when you can. Mother, Akiko sat on her bunk holding the letter, unable to move. Kenji had finally tasted chocolate. 1 bar. The first sweetness in 2 years. And she had eaten 15 chocolate bars since arriving at Fort Mason. The guilt was a physical weight in her chest, making it hard to breathe. On December 1st, Colonel Harrison made an announcement that stunned the assembled prisoners. I've received approval from command for a Christmas program. Each prisoner of war will receive a gift package on December 25th. Additionally, we're organizing a letter-writing campaign. Care packages to your families in Japan will be sent through the Red Cross. Silence. Then Akiko raised her hand, her voice clear in the quiet room. Colonel Harrison, forgive me. Why do this for enemies? The colonel looked at her for a long moment. Because the war is over, Miss Tanaka, and because the Geneva Convention says prisoners deserve dignity. But honestly, because it's the right thing to do. Showing mercy when you don't have to, that's what separates us from brutality. That's what makes us American. For the first time, Akiko allowed herself to write a real letter home, not just the careful, brief messages that said nothing. She sat with Wekbergan and let the truth pour out. Dear Mother, I know you picture me suffering, but I must tell truth. Americans treat us with unexpected kindness. We have food, shelter, medical care. They pay us wages. They invite us to their holidays. I do not understand it, but I cannot deny it. I met an American soldier who lost wife and daughter at Pearl Harbor. We cried together at Thanksgiving. I don't know what this means for future, but I know this. The enemy is not what we were told. Neither are we what they expected. Please tell Kenji I think of him every day. Tell him Americans are sending care packages. Maybe food will reach you. Maybe these letters will reach you. Maybe someday we will understand how mercy can be stronger than revenge. I love you. I will come home when I can. But I will come home different, Akiko. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear. The mess hall had been decorated again, this time with paper snowflakes cut by patients in the hospital, with a donated Christmas tree decorated by prisoners and Americans working together, with stockings hung along one wall, each one bearing a woman's name, carefully written in English and Japanese characters both. After breakfast, gifts were distributed. Each woman received a wrapped-in package, the paper bright and festive, in a way that seemed to belong to a different world. Akiko opened hers slowly. Inside, she found lipstick in deep red, a small bottle of perfume that smelled of lilacs, like the soap from that first day, an embroidered handkerchief, a box of assorted chocolates, a notebook and fountain pen, and a small empty photo frame. The card attached read, "Merry Christmas. You are not forgotten. The staff of Fort Mason POW facility." Around her, women were crying as they opened their gifts. These weren't necessities. These were dignity. These were the things that said, "You matter, you are human, you are seen." Reiko held up her lipstick with shaking hands. "Why do they give us these things? They want us to remember we are still human," Michiko said quietly. "Even though we are prisoners, even though we are enemies, they want us to know we still matter." The realization moved through the room like a wave. Kindness wasn't weakness, wasn't foolishness. It was a choice, conscious and powerful. It said, "I see you as human even when I don't have to." That was mercy. That was what these gifts meant. Later, Jim found Akiko in the hospital where she was working. He handed her a small wrapped package. "This isn't from the army. This is from me." She opened it to find a carved wooden crane, the work careful and precise. Every feather defined the wings spread as if in flight. "It's a crane," Jim said. "I know in Japanese culture cranes mean hope, long life, peace. Yes, peace." She held it carefully, feeling the smooth wood under her fingers. "Thank you, Jim. I will keep this always. I made it in the carpentry shop. Took me 3 weeks, kept messing up the wings. But I wanted you to have something to remember. Not the war, but after. What comes after." She looked at him, this man who had lost everything and chosen mercy anyway, and felt something shift in her understanding of the world. "What comes after is this," she said. "People choosing to be kind. People choosing to see each other. That is what comes after." Spring 1946 arrived with the announcement everyone had been waiting for and dreading. Repatriation. Ships would leave for Japan in April. The women should have felt pure joy. Instead, they felt something complicated. Joy at seeing family, fear of what they would find, and strange unexpected sadness at leaving this place where they had been prisoners, but also where they had learned that enemies could become human, that mercy existed even in the aftermath of war. April 10th. The docks. The same dock where they had arrived 7 months earlier, expecting death. The USS General M.C. Meigs waited ready to carry them across the ocean, back to a homeland that would be unrecognizable, destroyed and rebuilt, and forever changed. 237 women gathered for the final time, carrying bags of belongings that included gifts and letters and small tokens from people who had been guards and became something more complicated than that. Colonel Harrison gave a final speech. "You came here as enemies. You leave it as something else. Not friends, perhaps. Not yet. But as people we've shared meals with, worked beside, learned from. We wish you safe journey home. We hope you find your families well. We hope you carry with you the knowledge that mercy exists, that kindness exists even in the aftermath of war. Go in peace. The American staff lined up to say goodbye. Danny hugged Reiko, both of them crying. You tell your family about Iowa, okay? Tell them not all Americans are monsters. I will tell them Americans are just people, like us. Michiko bowed deeply to Lieutenant Brennan. You gave me my life twice. Once when you sewed my wrists. Once when you taught me I deserve to live. You saved yourself, Michiko. I just stopped the bleeding. They embraced two women who had seen too much death, choosing to honor life. As Akiko walked toward the gangway, Jim called her name. She turned. He was holding the wooden crane. You forgot this. I did not forget. I left it for you, so you remember. Peace is possible. Jim pulled dog tags from around his neck. Catherine's name was engraved on them, the metal worn smooth from 4 years of being carried close to his heart. Take these instead. So you remember too. Remember that Catherine and Emma were real, that they mattered, that hate didn't kill them, war did. And we can choose something different. Akiko took the tags and pressed them to her heart. I will carry them always. And when my brother asks me about America, I will tell him truth, that I met a man who lost everything, and he chose mercy over revenge. That is what I will tell him. Will I ever see you again? I do not know. But you will be with me in every choice I make. In every moment I choose mercy instead of hate. The gangway raised. The ship's horn blasted 3 times the same sound as their arrival, but with different meaning now. The women stood at the rail waving. The Americans waved back from the dock. Akiko watched San Francisco fade into fog, watched the Golden Gate Bridge that had once seemed like a passage to death become a symbol of transformation, of the distance traveled not in miles but in understanding. 20 years later, Akiko returned to San Francisco with her daughter Yuki, 18 years old and curious about her mother's past. They stood before the Golden Gate Bridge in sunshine that made the red towers glow. Mother, were you afraid when you came here? Terrified. But I learned that kindness can break you as completely as cruelty, and rebuild you more completely than victory ever could. The scars of war last forever, but so does the memory of mercy. Both leave permanent marks. We choose which one defines us. Kenji survived. He is 30 now. Father of 3, teaches music in Osaka. He never tasted Private Danny's pumpkin pie. Danny died in a car accident in 1952. But I told Kenji the story, and he tells his children about the American soldier who promised pie to a boy he would never meet. That promise kept in the telling. This is what I teach my nursing students. Mercy can shatter you as completely as war, and mercy can rebuild you more completely than victory ever could. This is the legacy we leave. Not of battles won or lost, but of the moment we chose to see each other's faces and remembered we are all just people who lost people. And sometimes that shared sorrow is enough to build a bridge.